He never said he wanted her. He didn't have to. The way he watched her from across the room said everything his silence refused to. Mabel Kingsley came to Chicago to start over. Quiet, careful, asking nothing from anyone. She was good at disappearing into her work, at being the woman no one really looked at twice. Until the one man everyone feared looked at her like she was the only person in the room. Declan Abernathy didn't share his time, his space, or his attention, not with anyone. So when he claimed hers, nobody in that building missed it, and neither did she. This is a story about two people who tried very hard not to fall, and how beautifully they failed. If you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now let's get into today's story. Mabel Kingsley had a rule about powerful men. Don't make yourself interesting to them. It was a rule she'd developed quietly, over years, the way you develop most useful rules, by breaking them once and paying for it. So when Sandra told her she was being moved to Declan Abernathy's team, her first instinct wasn't excitement. It was the particular stillness of someone calculating the cost of something before agreeing to pay it. She took the folder. She said thank you. She went home that night and stood at her kitchen window looking out at the Chicago skyline, the lake somewhere dark beyond the lights, and told herself it was just a temporary assignment. 6 weeks. She could be professional for 6 weeks. She was always professional. It was practically her whole personality. The 14th floor executive suite was different from the rest of the building in the way that expensive things are different. Not louder, but quieter. Heavier. The carpet absorbed sound. The light came from fixtures that had been chosen deliberately. Mabel arrived at 8:57 on Monday morning, folder pressed to her chest, and found Declan already at the head of the conference table. He wasn't reviewing notes or checking his phone the way people do when they're performing busyness. He was simply reading, with the complete stillness of someone who had never once confused motion with productivity. He looked up when she walked in, dark eyes, unhurried. The kind of attention that doesn't scan, it lands. "Mabel Kingsley," he said, not a question. Like he'd already read her file and formed a conclusion. "Mr. Abernathy." She set her folder on the table and took the seat 2 chairs down from his, which felt like the professionally appropriate distance, and also, if she was honest, the distance she needed to think clearly. He watched her do it. Something in his expression shifted, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "I reviewed your work on the Harmon account," he said. "The restructured narrative for the investor deck." She nodded. The original framing was burying the lead. It was. He closed his tablet. "You moved the risk section to the front. Investors read 3 slides and make a decision. Better to give them the hard part first while they're still paying attention." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, evaluative. The kind of pause that means someone is actually thinking about what you said instead of just waiting to respond. "Why didn't you flag it through your manager?" Mabel met his eyes. "I did. She said the client liked the original structure." "But you changed it anyway." "I changed it because it was the right call." She said it evenly, without apology, and watched something in his face settle, like a question he'd been carrying had just been answered to his satisfaction. He didn't smile, but the quality of his attention changed. It became, somehow, more deliberate. They worked through the morning without ceremony. He was demanding in the way that genuinely intelligent people are demanding. Not arbitrary, not ego-driven, but precise. He caught things. He asked questions that required real answers. And he listened, which Mabel hadn't expected, because men with his kind of authority rarely did. By noon, she had stopped thinking about the 6 weeks. She was just thinking about the work, which was, she would realize later, exactly how it started. Not with a look or a moment or anything she could have defended herself against. Just the quiet, dangerous realization that she was completely comfortable in a room where she had fully intended to feel nothing. The second week was harder to explain away. The first week, Mabel had managed with logic, new assignment, steep learning curve, the natural focus that comes with proving yourself in unfamiliar territory. But the second week didn't have the same clean excuse. She already knew the rhythm of his mornings, the way he took his coffee without sugar, the specific quality of silence he used when he was thinking versus when he was simply waiting for someone to stop wasting his time. She knew these things without having tried to learn them, which was the part that unsettled her most. Declan moved through the office with an ease that still surprised her, though she'd stopped letting that surprise show on her face. His chair was something he navigated with a kind of precise efficiency. Around the conference table, through the glass corridor that connected the executive suite to the open floor, into the elevator, with a familiarity that made it clear he had long stopped asking the building's permission to exist in it. He took up space without apology. She found that, quietly, she admired it. Tuesday of that second week, they disagreed. It wasn't dramatic, just a clean, direct collision of different thinking. Mabel had restructured the timeline on a client presentation, moving the product roadmap ahead of the financial projections. Her reasoning was solid: lead with vision, follow with numbers. Declan read through it without expression, and then looked at her across the table. You moved the roadmap. It reads better that way. The financials land harder when the audience already believes in the product. This client thinks in numbers first. Vision is decoration to them, then we're presenting to their bias instead of shifting it. The silence that followed had texture. He didn't look annoyed. He looked interested, which was somehow more unsettling. Shift it back, he said finally, and flag your reasoning in the speaker notes. If you're right, we'll see it in the room. She wanted to push back. She didn't. Not because she lacked the confidence, but because she understood, in that moment, that he wasn't dismissing her. He was testing whether she could lose a small battle without losing her footing. That distinction mattered. She flagged her reasoning in the notes. Thorough, precise, unapologetic. When she sent the file back to him that evening, his response came 12 minutes later. 3 words. Good speaker notes. She stared at her screen longer than necessary. That same evening, staying late to finish revisions, she looked up to find him in the doorway of the conference room, not entering, just present, jacket still on, the hallway light behind him casting everything in that amber tone Chicago offices get after 6, when half the overheads shut off. You eat dinner? He asked. It was such a plainly practical question that it took her a beat to register it wasn't rhetorical. I was going to order something. There's a place 2 blocks east. Good food, fast. He said it without ceremony, already turning slightly, the way people do when they're extending an invitation they've decided not to make awkward. Mabel saved her document, closed her laptop, told herself it was just dinner between colleagues, the kind of thing that happened in offices all the time. She was almost convinced by the time they reached the elevator. Almost. The restaurant was called Nell's, and it was exactly what he'd promised. Good food, fast, with exposed brick walls and lighting that made everything feel slightly more honest than fluorescent offices allowed. They took a table near the window, Declan positioning himself at the end, with the practiced ease of someone who had long since stopped waiting for others to figure out the logistics. Mabel sat across from him and picked up the menu mostly to have something to do with her hands. It was the first time they'd been somewhere that wasn't a conference room or a corridor, and the absence of a professional framework made her aware of things she'd been successfully ignoring. Like the way his hands looked around a water glass, broad, unhurried. Like the fact that without the context of work between them, he was even harder to look at directly. She ordered the roasted chicken. He ordered the same without looking at the menu, which told her he'd been here enough times to not need it. "How long have you been at Hartwell?" he asked. 8 months. Before that? Nashville, communications director for a mid-size healthcare consultancy. Why Chicago? She looked up from her water glass. Most people ask that question the way people ask about weather, conversationally, without expecting a real answer. He asked it like he actually wanted to know. "I needed a city that didn't already have an opinion about me," she said. It was more honest than she'd intended. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, just a slight recalibration, like a man updating a file. "That's a specific reason," he said. "Most people say opportunity. Most people don't say the real thing." The words landed between them with a weight she hadn't planned for. Declan held her gaze for a moment, and Mabel had the disorienting sensation of being genuinely seen. Not assessed, not cataloged, but seen. She reached for her water. He let her have the redirect. The food came, and the conversation moved into safer territory. The firm, the Chicago tech landscape, a client he found interesting for reasons that had nothing to do with the contract. He was different here. Not softer exactly, but less armored. He had opinions about things that had nothing to do with strategy, and he delivered them with a dry specificity that made her laugh twice before she realized she'd stopped being careful. He noticed. She could tell because the corner of his mouth moved in a way it hadn't in 2 weeks of conference rooms. When the check came, he settled it before she'd located her card, and did it with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything. Not a performance, just a decision already made. Outside, the October wind hit immediately. Mabel pulled her coat tighter, and they moved toward the building, the sidewalk narrow enough that she was closer to him than she'd been all evening. She was aware of the proximity in a way that registered somewhere below thought. At the lobby door, they stopped. "Good speaker notes again tonight," he said. It took her a half second. Then she understood he meant the dinner conversation. Her real answers. Her actual self. She didn't respond. She just looked at him in the amber light of the lobby entrance, with the wind moving her hair and the city loud around them, and felt something shift inside her chest, with the slow, irreversible quality of a tide changing direction. She went home telling herself it meant nothing, but she didn't believe it anymore. The corporate event was held at a private dining room on the 32nd floor of a hotel in Streeterville. All floor-to-ceiling windows and candlelight that turned Lake Michigan into something that looked painted rather than real. Declan had told her simply that he needed someone from his team present, someone who knew the Callaway account. Mabel had said yes without overthinking it. She was getting worse at that around him. She arrived in a dark green dress she'd bought in Nashville and never worn. Fitted, simple, nothing that tried too hard. She stepped off the elevator and found him already in the room near the window, speaking with 2 partners. Dark suit, no tie, the city spread behind him like something arranged for that exact moment. He saw her cross the room before she reached the group. His gaze moved over her once, unhurried, controlled, and returned to the conversation as though nothing had shifted. But something had. She'd felt it like a change in air pressure, and she filed it away without comment. The evening moved well. Mabel was good in rooms like this. She knew how to make people feel heard without giving too much of herself away. She handled the Callaway clients with ease, answered questions cleanly, laughed at the right moments. At dinner, they were seated beside each other, proximity unavoidable at the round table. His arm rested near hers for most of the main course, not touching, just close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in a way that required conscious effort to ignore. Richard Calloway, generous with both wine and observation, looked between them at one point and said they made a strong team. Asked how long they'd worked together. 3 weeks, Mabel said. Feels longer, Declan said at the same moment. The table laughed. She reached for her water and felt his fingers brush the back of her hand. Brief, deliberate, and completely intentional. She didn't look at him. She didn't trust what her face would do. After dinner, the group moved toward the hotel bar for a final drink. The atmosphere looser now, the professional choreography softening at the edges. Mabel was waiting for a glass of wine when a man appeared beside her, one of the junior partners from another firm, tall, confident in the way of someone who had been told he was charming too many times. He introduced himself and positioned himself in a way that closed off the rest of the room. She answered politely, gave nothing. He didn't read it. She was mid-sentence when the atmosphere shifted, that specific change that happened when Declan moved through a space. He came to a stop beside her without rushing, without performing, just arriving, the way someone arrives somewhere they've already decided belongs to them. He looked at her first, one calm, quiet look. Then he turned to the man beside her with an expression that was entirely civil and completely immovable, and his voice came low and even, without a single degree of heat. I don't share. The man looked between them, made the correct decision, and excused himself. The noise of the room continued around them, but where they stood, the silence had weight. Mabel turned to look at him. He was already looking at her, steady, unapologetic, and open in a way she hadn't seen before. She wasn't angry. She'd expected to be. That was the part she couldn't explain on the car ride home, while the city moved past the windows, and neither of them said a word about what had just happened. She stared at the lights and understood, with the quiet certainty of something that had already been decided without her permission, that she was in serious trouble. She didn't sleep well. That was the first consequence. She lay in her apartment on the 15th floor with the city glowing faintly through the curtains, and replayed the moment in the hotel bar with the analytical detachment of someone trying very hard to be rational about something that wasn't rational at all. He had spoken for her, without asking, without hesitating. And the part that kept her awake wasn't what he'd said. It was that she had stood there in the aftermath, in the quiet that followed, and felt something settle inside her chest, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was closed. She got up at 6, made coffee, and decided to be professional about it. She was good at professional. It was practically load-bearing at this point. Monday morning arrived with the indifference of all Monday mornings. She walked into the executive suite at 8:55, set her bag down, opened her laptop, and did not think about the way his fingers had brushed the back of her hand at dinner. She was mostly successful. Declan arrived at 9. He moved through the suite with his usual composed efficiency, exchanged brief words with his assistant, and then appeared in the doorway of the conference room where Mabel was already set up with the week's materials spread across the table. He looked at her the way he always did, direct, unhurried, and said good morning like nothing had shifted between them. Like Friday night had been a perfectly ordinary, professional evening. Good morning, she said, matching his tone exactly. They worked through the morning without acknowledging any of it, which should have felt like a relief. It didn't. By midday, the not acknowledging had become its own presence in the room, a third party that sat between them at the table and made the air slightly harder to breathe. She was reviewing a client brief when he spoke without looking up from his screen. You've been quiet. I'm always quiet. Not like this. She looked up. He was watching her now, pen set down, giving her his full attention in that way he had that made everything else in the room feel peripheral. She held his gaze for a moment, weighing how honest to be. You could have just asked me if I needed help, she said. With Marcus. Something moved behind his eyes. I know. That would have been the professional thing. Yes. He said it without apology, without explanation, and without looking away. Just yes. Simple and complete. The admission of a man who knew exactly what he'd done and had made his peace with it before she'd finished the sentence. Mabel looked back down at her brief. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. The afternoon brought a strategy call that ran long, a revision cycle that bled into evening, and the gradual emptying of the floor around them until it was just the two of them again, under the low hum of the overhead lights. At some point, he rolled back from the table and stretched his arms above his head, and she caught herself watching the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt before she could redirect her attention. He didn't catch her. Or if he did, he said nothing. But when he turned back to his screen, there was the faintest suggestion of a smile at the corner of his mouth that hadn't been there before. And Mabel understood, with a clarity that was almost inconvenient, that Declan Abernathy was many things: demanding, controlled, precise. But he was not, in any way, oblivious. The next 4 weeks moved with a speed that felt deliberately unfair. They fell into a rhythm of shared coffee orders, unspoken agreements, and a comfortable proximity that neither of them tried to correct. They never talked about the hotel bar. They didn't have to. The quiet understanding between them became the gravity of the 14th floor, pulling Mabel further away from the realization that her time there was running out. Her final week ended the way difficult things often do. Not with a confrontation, but with a moment so quiet it was almost easy to miss. It was Thursday evening. The floor was empty, the city dark beyond the windows, and Mabel was pulling on her coat when Declan spoke from across the room. "Christine's coming back Monday." She stilled. She'd known it was coming. 6 weeks had always been the arrangement. But hearing it said out loud, plainly, in his voice, landed differently than she'd expected. She turned to face him. He was at the end of the conference table, not pretending to work, not filling the silence with anything unnecessary, just watching her, with that steadiness she'd spent 6 weeks learning to read. "Right," she said. "Back to the 14th floor." "Yes." A beat. Then, "Unless you don't want to go back." The words arrived without drama, without the performance of a man who had rehearsed them. He said it the way he said everything, directly, with full awareness of what he was actually asking. Mabel felt the particular stillness that comes right before a decision. She looked at him across the length of the conference table, this man who had upended her carefully maintained equilibrium without ever raising his voice, who had looked at her like she was the most relevant thing in any room they'd shared, who had said, "I don't share," in front of a crowd, and meant every word of it. What would staying look like, she asked. It was a real question. She needed a real answer. He was quiet for a moment, and she understood that the pause wasn't hesitation. It was precision. He didn't speak until he knew what he meant to say. "It would look like this," he said, "but honest." The simplicity of it hit her somewhere undefended. No promises dressed up as certainty. No performance of a man who had everything figured out. Just this, but honest. She crossed the room slowly, stopping at the corner of the table closest to him. Close enough that the conversation had changed into something that required less distance. "I don't do complicated well," she said quietly. "I spent a long time in situations where the terms kept changing." "I know." His voice was low. "I'm not interested in changing the terms." She studied his face, the dark eyes that had been watching her since the first morning, the jaw she had become, against her better judgment, genuinely fond of. She could feel her own heartbeat. She was aware, distantly, that she was standing at the edge of something, and that stepping forward was entirely her choice. She reached out and set her hand on the table beside his, not touching, just near. An answer that wasn't quite an answer yet, but was no longer a refusal. His hand moved to cover hers, warm, certain, unhurried. And Mabel Kingsley, who had come to Chicago to belong to no one, stood in the quiet of an empty office on a Thursday night and felt, for the first time in longer than she could name, like she was exactly where she had chosen to be. You just watched something begin, and you already know it's not going to be simple. That was part 1. Drop a number in the comments, 1 to 10. Tell me how much you felt that last scene. And if you think you're ready for what comes next, part 2 is already waiting. Let's see if you can handle it.